Hello again, everybody. This is Derek, and I'm coming back at you with another wargaming and miniature video. In today's video, we're continuing on with our Land of the Free boot camp. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about elements, element sizes, and element statistics and formations of your elements. And then we'll talk about front and flank, an arc of fire, an arc of sight, and that should be this video. If you haven't watched the first video, you should go back and watch the first video, as it's an introduction to what this boot camp is all about. All right, let's talk about our elements. Okay, so you may be familiar with the terms platoon, company, battalion, brigade, etc., right? Where in these rules, Land of the Free rules, they don't use those terms to represent your maneuver elements, because you may play at a different level of game. So you might, like, these might be brigades, they might be regiments, they might be companies. It's whatever you want them to be. So I plan to represent about a battalion-sized element. But in this game, it's called just an element. And you can transpose or transfer the word element into the word unit if you wish. An element is made up of one or more stands of miniatures depending on the scale of the game. So this is a stand of figures. The term element represents any type of military unit, whether it refers to a few miniatures or a large group of soldiers. There's 4 types of elements that will be used throughout play: tiny, small, medium, and large. Now, the rules recommend that to maintain a feel of historical battle, tiny, small, medium, and large elements should have a natural military progression in size. For example, a small element could represent a squad. A medium element would then represent a platoon. And then a large element would be a full company. Below, now I have a chart, and I'll put it up on the screen, what they provide. And they basically they're giving you the military definition of a group or an element, like file, patrol, platoon, battalion, regiment, etc. How many men you would expect to be in that type of unit. And, like, let's look at a platoon. A platoon would have 26 to 55 men, and it would comprise of 2 or more sections. And the commander would be a lieutenant. So really, that's just kind of a historical breakdown. Like if you're doing research or trying to figure out the unit sizes for your game, or for a battle that you've read about, you can refer to that chart. Now, when it comes to figures and miniatures, the 4 types of elements, tiny, small, medium, and large, also should have a number of bases and numbers of figures. A tiny element should be 2 to 6 figures. Now, and it could represent 1 to 3 stands. Now, in my games, I'm going to use 1 stand with 6 figures to represent a tiny element. This is a very small, tiny element. A small element should have anywhere between 4 and 12 miniatures, also mounted on between 1 and 3. So I am going to use 12 miniatures and 2 stands to represent a small element. So you went tiny, small. Now a medium-sized element, this is the most common element, should be between 6 to 18 miniatures, mounted anywhere from 3 to 6 stands. Okay, so this is a medium-sized element. It has the 18 figures and it has the 3 stands. If you have them mounted maybe on single file, that's where you would get the full 6 stands. But I'm mounting mine 6 figures on a base and a total of 18 figures representing a medium element. Now a large element is going to be 5 to 7 stands between 10 and 30 miniatures. Well, here you go. This has 5 stands and 30 miniatures. But again, you can use any number of stands to represent your units, your elements, but just keep it consistent throughout all of your army and your opponent's army as well, or it won't work out right. You want to have the same number represented. All right, now that also applies to cavalry. So a 3-stand cavalry unit is a medium-sized element, and a 3-stand or 3-gun artillery battery is also a medium-sized element. Okay, now 3 types of elements. And here, you have infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Now, different nations might have different types of infantry depending on their doctrine, but as an example, Great Britain had center companies, nicknamed Hatmen, as well as flank companies consisting of light infantry and grenadiers. And the German mercenaries during the Revolutionary War had musketeers, fusiliers, grenadiers, and Jaegers. And no matter what name each nation assigned to their troop, the role on the battlefield was similar. And special elements will have rules discussed later in the book, basically in the advanced and the optional rules. And I will show a chart for each type of element. We're going to start with the infantry element on the screen. You'll see that the weapon is a musket, and it might be either smoothbore or rifled. Smoothbore musket is the most common. Whenever you call something a musket, it's pretty much a smoothbore, because rifled muskets are usually called rifles. And then you'll see it's got a range 12 and 18 inches depending on which one you're using. And if you're building an army with points and you give them rifled muskets, you need to add 5 points. Okay, now let's switch over to cavalry. You'll see that they have a carbine, a pistol, and a sword, and they have mixed weapons. Could be a pistol, carbine, could be a shotgun, whatever. It has a range of 6 inches. There's also tiny, small, medium, and large. They have all the stats, and you'll notice the point values on the far right. And then the final chart is artillery. That artillery can be cannons, they can be mortars, they can be rockets, they can be howitzers. Okay, and you look at the weapon types, you got 12-pound or less, and then you got artillery greater than 12 pounds. You have siege mortars, and you have rockets only usable in the War of 1812. And they have only small, medium, and large. there's no tiny artillery units. And again, like I said, in just a couple of pages here in the rules, we'll be talking about the element stats. Before we do that, let's talk about an element leader. Okay, except for elements consisting of only one stand, tiny, they must always have a recognizable miniature present within the ranks. The miniature could be a non-commissioned officer, it could be an officer, it could be a drummer, it could be a standard bearer. What I like to do is I'll make a command or a leader stand, and it'll have the officer, the drummer, the standard bearers, and every element will have one of these, even the cap. And it should be located in the center of the element. So if you've got a 3-stand element, it should be in the center. If you've got a 5-stand element, it should be in the center. And even with cavalry and march, it should also be in the center. This guy's out of place. For rules purposes, the central figure or stand will be referred to as the leader. For this reason, it's a good idea to have each element represented by an odd number of stands, so the leader can occupy the middle element. He'll play an integral part in establishing the vision and distance to stands and enemy elements. Now, we've already talked about groups a little bit in the previous video, but a group commander will have a group between 2 to 6 elements. So a group commander here would have 2 to 6 elements, but the elements can be of any size. So you could have like 6 tiny elements if you wanted. And the group commander is directly responsible for the performance of the elements during the game, and is the only officer besides the force commander who can issue orders to elements under his charge. Okay, a force commander is in direct control of all the group commanders, so indirectly commands the elements. A force commander has the freedom to involve himself in the ordering process and is the only commander who may take direct control of any element. Depending on the size of the game, a force commander's rank could range from a sergeant major to a general. Now, commanders can be represented by using mounted or dismounted officers. Since the movement value is not affected by the type of miniature being used, you may also want to take this opportunity to create mini dioramas for the commander and turn their bases into a great hobby project. Okay, let's talk about those element statistics that we were talking about earlier. And here's a generic infantry statistics for a medium unit. I'll put this up on the screen. You'll see that it says infantry, and it's got size medium, and here are the stats. Maneuver, combat, discipline, morale, action, and points may have numbers. Okay, the maneuver order. Okay, that first one is maneuver orders. This value represents the number of movement, formation changes, facings, or reloads an element may perform during the game. Combat order. The next one is combat, but it's also orders. I wish it actually on the chart said maneuver order and combat order, so it wouldn't be confused with like combat dice or something. Okay, shooting and melee are performed by spending combat orders. This value represents the number of times an element may fire their weapons or fight in melee during a single activation. You'll notice that it's more than one. It's a 3. So you can shoot 3 times, sort of. We'll get into that in just half a second. Okay. Discipline. An element's ability to maintain cohesion during play is vital for its survivability. Discipline represents the element's ability to take hits from shooting and melee. The higher the number, the more the element can maintain its cohesion during combat. But as it takes hits, it will lose discipline, eventually becoming combat effective. There are 4 levels of discipline that elements will experience during play. Fit, that would be healthy and how everybody starts. shaken, meaning they're a little bit worried. Then you have exhausted. They've taken quite a few casualties. And then shattered. Okay, each time an element takes hits equal to its discipline, it'll drop to the next level of discipline until it reaches shattered, at which point you pick up the element and take it off. Shattered is not marked on the table. You pick the figures up. So you don't need a token to mark shattered. You will need some kind of token to represent the hits a unit has taken. Sometimes glass beads will work to represent how many hits it's taken. Or you can mark it on a sheet of paper off screen, or you can have a dial, or you can put wounded markers down, whatever you want to represent these hits. But then once it becomes the next level down, shaken, you'll need to mark it with something that represents that it's shaken. And then once it takes another group of hits, you're going to have to mark it with exhausted. What I plan to do is use a yellow marker to let you know that this unit is shaken, right? It's a little cautious. And then when it becomes exhausted, we'll elevate that yellow to a red. And so now he's become exhausted. Now once the unit is exhausted and then it goes to the next level, shattered, you can just pick the unit up so you don't need to mark it. Hit has no marker, shaken, exhausted, and then shattered. Those are the levels of discipline. Okay, morale. You'll see it says 7+. The value represents the target number needed to roll on 2 dice in order to pass the morale test that the element's required to take. The more an element suffers during the game, the harder it is for commanders to keep the element intact. Each morale test will always be taken using 2 dice. Morale tests can be modified depending on the situation, and that's covered later in the game. Actions. Okay, these are action dice. The number allows the player to roll that many d6 when performing a combat order. So if you use one of your combat orders to shoot, he's going to roll 4 dice. Or when it's fighting in melee, same number. Now the number of dice can be modified based on the situation and discipline, and these modifiers are discussed later. And then points. That's just, you know what that is. That's when you're building your army, you spend points. You might be playing a 200-point game, and you go through, you build your army using points to get up to 200 or less. Okay, let's talk about formation. Infantry and cavalry. Soldiers fighting in linear tactics were closely monitored by non-commissioned and low-ranking officers in order to maintain discipline and keep the fighting ranks organized. This process was made easier when the enlisted soldiers were formed into blocks or formations which officers positioned along the perimeter to keep the ranks dressed and organized. These rules utilize the formations during gameplay as an aesthetic and rule mechanic. Below is a list of the formations that infantry, cavalry, and artillery can use throughout the game. The first is called battle line. An element consisting of 2 or more bases and has all of its stands in base-to-base contact, basically everybody out here, except for them, facing in the same direction is in battle line. An element in battle line will maintain a flat frontage when maneuvering unless it is occupying a linear obstacle such as a fence line to gain defensive bonuses. An element in battle line creates a stalwart defense and generates a more deadly impact in melee, but the densely packed formation makes it an optimum target with an inability to navigate terrain quickly. Battle line will block line of sight for other elements. Okay, so you cannot see through a battle line to beyond. Friend or foe. Can't shoot through your own guys. Open order or warband. Organized military formations would create gaps between their soldiers in order to reduce casualties. Navigate the landscape more easily, and create a large frontage to occupy space. The formation would be called upon to open its ranks into open order. Native Americans did not operate as cohesively as the European cousins, but to avoid cumbersome rules and special formations, Indians will use the open order. Players are free to call this formation a warband when referring to Indians, but essentially it operates exactly like elements in open order. Okay, what does it look like? The element has its stands facing in the same direction and separated by no more than 1 inch, and it maintains a flat frontage, much like battle line. The line does not arc in any way unless occupying a linear obstacle. The open order formation allows for better movement in difficult terrain and avoids excess casualties, but the spacing between soldiers does not make it a very effective melee formation. Open order does not block line of sight for friendly or enemy elements. Okay, you can see through an open order element. Okay, the next one is march column, or Indian file, or ranger file. The best way for troops to cover ground quickly was to form into march column. The element would have a narrow frontage of 2 to 4 soldiers, but would be several ranks deep. Realistically, soldiers did not walk any faster in march column compared to other formations, but their narrow frontage enabled the element to utilize roads and snake around difficult scenery. Indians used a similar formation that has become known as Indian file, since they would often move one behind the other, traversing difficult woodlands in North America. An element in march column, or Indian file, has its stands one behind the other, facing in the same direction. Okay, I had noticed my camera was frozen, and I don't know if you got a hold of any of these other formations or where it got stopped. So we'll just quickly go over this again. Battle line is like such, where you have all the figures facing in the same direction, base to base, and it blocks line of sight. Then you have open order, which is when you have all your figures facing in the same direction, side by side, but with a gap of up to 1 inch apart, no more than 1 inch, which does not block line of sight. And then we've got march column, or Indian file, which every figure's the same width. You put them back to back, one behind the other, facing in the same direction, with the leader positioned in the center of the element. They're always putting the leader in the center, even though, you would expect the flags and everything to be in the front. And I personally would not worry if a player did, or if I do something like this. That looks better, right? That's more accurate. But for game purposes, all the measurements are done from the center. And that's really all you got to know. Since the leader is located in the middle, it would be impossible to draw a proper line of sight for shooting or declaring charges. So these orders are prohibited in this formation. Yeah, because you're measuring from your leader. It's very effective for covering ground quickly, but incredibly vulnerable to attack. An element in march column is not prepared for combat and does not pose an immediate threat. So for this reason, it does not have a threat zone, which we'll talk about later. Elements in march column block line of sight for other elements. So once your bases are touching like this, in line or march column, they block line of sight. But if you were in open order, again, always facing in the same direction, no more than 1 inch apart, they don't block line of sight. Because the guys are skirmishing, let's say. Okay, we talked about it. Small elements, or tiny elements, is a one-stand element. A single-stand element is considered to be in open order all the time, and may only change formation into march column. The single stand is always considered to be the leader, of course, because there's only one stand. Square formation. The concept of forming square during these wars is not completely unknown, and variations of this formation may have been used, but because heavy cavalry and shock cavalry do not play any major role in these conflicts, the rules will not incorporate square formations. So there's no square option in Land of the Free. Artillery. Okay, we got artillery guns up here. They have two formations, unlimbered and limbered. Unlimbered artillery elements, unlimbered, follow the same rules as elements in open order, but there are exceptions, which are outlined later in the rules. Okay, and they're showing them being separated, facing the same direction, no more than 1 inch apart. Personally, I don't see a problem with them being base to base, because you can tell that's unlimbered because they're all facing the same direction. But they follow the same rules as open order, so if you want to separate them up to 1 inch, you can. Limbered. Okay, much like march column, limbered artillery elements have its stands touching one behind the other, with the leader of the element in the center, or as close to the center of formation as possible, as long as there's at least one stand in front of the leader. If the artillery element consists of one stand, then turn the base around with the rear of the base facing the enemy. Limbered artillery blocks line of sight for other elements. This formation does not have a threat zone, cannot fire or charge. Then again, what sane commander would charge with limbered guns? That's funny. Okay, I personally plan on making a limbered or a limber with a horse and the tow carriage, the limber. Now, what I'm trying to decide is, this is for my personal collection. If I have a two-gun element, am I going to put a limber down with one gun and then just put the limber, replace one of the guns with the limber element, and it'll look better? Or if I have a three-gun element, I think what I'm going to do is pull one of the guns off, replace it with a limber, or maybe put the limber on the table next to it or something. I'm not sure. But for this game, there's no limber model required. It's just the way the elements are deployed. If they're facing in the same direction, they're unlimbered. And if they are facing one behind the other, they are limbered. Commanders. Group and force commanders do not have or require a formation. They are not considered an element and their base merely represents their presence on the battlefield. Commanders do not block line of sight, and if there is an instance when a friendly element comes into contact with the commander, then move the commander out of the way using the shortest route. So let's just say the commander's there, and these guys want to move forward a couple of inches, and they move. Just take this commander and just kind of shuffle him out of the way. He basically gets pushed. Okay, now we're going into line of sight and arc of sight. The closed rank formations of the colonial period served many purposes for the commanders who led their troops into battle. The soldiers fighting side by side improved morale for those individuals a little more reluctant to go into battle, and their firepower was greatly improved using the entire formation like a rudimentary blunderbuss. Unfortunately, visibility became severely limited, and reaction times were often slowed by the need for all the soldiers in the formation to move as one. Elements have two types of visibility and will be using during Land of the Free: arc of sight and line of sight. Arc of sight. An element has the ability to see anything within its front, extending in 45-degree angles from the corners of the outermost stands of the element. This is also referred to as the element's front. Alright, just for this purpose, I picked up an Arc of Fire template from War Basis, and it has the set actually includes different angles. It includes a 30 degree, a 22.5 degree, but it also has the 45 degree. And if you're trying to decide, you can put it on the end of your element, and then you would see that there is a line going out 45 degrees. So you can see where the arc of sight is. And surprisingly enough, these are 40 millimeters, and the bases here are 40 millimeters as well. Okay, the next one is line of sight. Okay, so that was the arc. Now the leader is responsible for dictating to his soldiers which direction to move and which enemies to attack, and for this reason, the line of sight is always drawn from any part of a leader's stand in the center of the element, in a straight line to the closest point of its intended target. So let's just say this to them, right? So you would measure from the closest part of the leader stand to the closest part of your target element. Straight line. This line can be drawn anywhere within the element's arc of sight to its intended target. So if the unit was like this, and remember this is the arc of sight, and you measure, it would actually go like this figure here, not these two. These two are out of the arc of sight. So when you're measuring, you don't have to measure a 45 from the leader. You just have to measure to the part that was in the arc of sight. So the measurement would be from this corner to that end, that part of the base. If the line of sight is unobstructed to its target, then the element has a clear line of sight. If the line of sight is blocked at any point during its path, then the line of sight is obscured and will have an impact on the element depending on which and what the obstruction is and the type of action taking place. Friendly and enemy elements can block line of sight depending on which formation they're in, which we talked about just a moment ago. The ability to draw a line of sight will allow the element to perform several orders such as shooting, charging, or affecting the element's ability to change formation. Okay, clear, cover, and blocked. When a leader draws a line of sight to a target element, it is important to determine if it's partially obscured or blocked. There could be several reasons and battlefield conditions that obscure a target, taking into consideration terrain, or the target may be partially outside the element's arc of sight. And when we get to shooting and scenery, we'll talk about those. If the line of sight from the element to its intended target is blocked in any capacity, then the target element is considered partially obscured and will receive a bonus for being in cover. The amount of the element that is blocked is inconsequential unless 100% of the element is blocked. A fully obscured or blocked target has 100% of its stands blocked from line of sight. Fully obscured elements are not eligible targets for shooting and charging. Okay, we're going to talk about front and flank and threat zones. An element realistically has 4 sides to its facing, but for gameplay purposes there are only 2. The front of the element is within the arc of sight. So remember, we use the 45-degree arc. So that's a front. Everything here all the way to there, those would all be, that would be its front. The flank of the element consists of everything else. So this is a flank, this is a flank, that's a flank. There's no rear. A rear is just called flank. Now, for an element to be considered in someone's flank, it would need to have its leader stand completely behind the target's front. So if this guy had an arc of sight like that, which it does, and the leader stand here was completely behind this line, he's in the flank. This unit is in the flank. If it was like this, and the leader was only partially behind, it's still considered in the front. Okay, threat zone. Every element in the game has an area directly to its front where it is the most dangerous. When the elements are in particular formations such as march column or limbered, they no longer have a threat zone. It extends 12 inches to the front of the element. Okay, now it's directly to the front, so it's not within arc of sight. You just take a threat zone straight out from the battalion, straight out, 12 inches. That's the threat zone. Commanders do not have a threat zone. Enemy elements within this zone are limited in the types of maneuvers they can perform because they feel threatened. Now, a threat zone represents the area where most weapons can be fired. The ranges of some weapons may extend past 12 inches, like a rifle, but the threat zone for all elements remain the same unless mentioned otherwise. So like a cavalry unit that only has a 6-inch range will still have a 12-inch threat zone. Measuring the movements or ranges should be consistent throughout the game. So it's important that all the players understand this process. There are 3 types of measuring. Measuring to a target, measuring distance for a maneuver, and measuring sphere of influence. So measuring to a target. Players will measure starting from any part of the leader's edge, base, to the closest part of his intended target. This measurement must be in a straight line from the starting point to the target. Okay, let's back up from measurements a little bit and let's talk about threat zones again. Okay, the rules will also state instances where the threat zone of the leader will be utilized. In these circumstances, the threat zone of a leader will extend 12 inches in parallel lines from the leader's base edges. Elements inside one or many threat zones will not be able to perform the following maneuvers unless they are forced to by failing a morale test. An element may not move into an enemy's threat zone while in march column. So you can't just deliberately get close to an element's front if you're in march column. You got to change out of that. An element may not move into the flank of an enemy element if the maneuvering element began its activation in its threat zone. Okay, so if you begin in someone's threat zone, you can't move around to get to their flank. Basically, you're stuck to stay in their front. Okay, back to measurements. Measuring to a target. Players will measure starting from the part of the leader's base edge to the closest part of the intended target. This measurement must be straight line from point to point. Okay, so if you're measuring to a target, you just measure from the leader's base to the closest part of the enemy's target. Okay, measuring distance for a maneuver. When ordering a maneuver, the movement is measured from the front of the leader's base edge to the distance you wish to move. The leader's front edge must be placed at the desired distance, and once the leader has moved, the remaining part of the element conforms around the leader. So basically, you just move the leader's base, and then you just bring everybody up to form the formation. Stands in an element may end up moving more or less than the leader, and this is perfectly allowed since the movement is always performed from the leader's command stand. Measuring a sphere of influence. A sphere of influence of a commander is always measured from the center of the commander's base to either the closest point of a friendly element's leader stand or the closest point of an enemy element. Okay, so if this guy's measuring his sphere of influence, he's measuring to the leader stand, not to the closest base. Now, the measuring convention, pre-measuring. The field of battle contains a myriad of distractions, preventing officers from consistently judging distances, smoke, landscape, obstacles, and soldiers are just a few of the items that can prevent an officer from estimating ranges. Not allowing pre-measuring would be a great way to represent the fog of war on the battlefield, but can often slow play down and create other problems. Within the game mechanics, for this reason, you are allowed to pre-measure at any time during the game to keep the flow of the game running smoothly and effectively. Okay, so players, as a player, you may argue that pre-measuring is kind of a cheat, but because the game is trying to be fast, fun, and playable, you are allowed to pre-measure. Okay, no sharing space. At no point during a game may more than one element occupy the same space. So you can't have your cav overlapping your infantry or whatever. If there is an instance when more than one element occupies the same space, then the active element will continue to move in its current direction until it occupies its own space on the gaming table. Players cannot purposefully place an active element so it ends its movement on top of another element, forcing it to leapfrog. The extra movement for the active element is in place for accidental situations when two elements share the same space. And that usually happens on a fallback or a retreat or something like that. But I can't say, I'm going to move 2 inches forward and then wind up being here and then say, oh, well, because we're occupying the same space, that means I've got to move forward until I get a free move. No. You would just stop before you reach that. But now if there's something forcing you to move, that's another story. All right, well, that was the end of this video. The next video, we're going to jump into orders. And we'll be talking about the active and the we'll be talking about the active and passive sides, understanding your orders, forced orders. Then we'll be talking about maneuvering orders, where you get to use those maneuver points on your statistics and formation changes. And then we'll talk about combat orders. And then there's also something like group orders and storing maneuver and combat orders. Kind of like Overwatch or React. Familiar with that. Plus there's interpenetration, and then accidental interpenetration. All right. Well, thank you for coming out and checking this out. Hopefully the middle of this video didn't get messed up too bad with my camera freezing. During editing, I'll try to fix what I can. And I'll catch you in the next video.